Hello, everyone. My name is Sue Regan. I'm Deputy CEO and Policy Director at Volunteering Australia. I'm delighted to be here welcoming you to this event to launch our latest research, the Story Project. I'm very pleased to be doing this in the lead up to National Volunteer Week, which, as I'm sure you all know, is next week. I wish to first acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we are all meeting from today. For me, here in Canberra, that is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, and I wish to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Before I run through the event this morning, I would like to thank the Scanlon Foundation, who provided funding and invaluable advice during this project. This research would not have been possible without the Scanlon Foundation, so thank you very much. So what's happening in this next hour? In a minute, I will hand over to Heba Aladawi, who will present her research findings from the Story Project. Heba is a research and policy officer here at Volunteering Australia, and she's also a PhD candidate at the Australian National University. She's getting very close to finishing her PhD. Her previous degrees are from Mount Holyoke College in the United States and from Oxford University in the UK. And we're very much looking forward to hearing the research findings this morning. We will then hand over to Sarah Wilson, the National Strategy Director at Volunteering Australia. I'm sure Sarah is familiar to many of you from her leadership in developing the new national strategy for volunteering. Sarah has degrees in art, psychology and law, and is currently completing her honours in psychology, and hence why soon she is stepping aside from her director role, but she will thankfully remain as an advisor on the national strategy. After Sarah's given some reflections, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. Please do take this opportunity to ask questions of Heba, Sarah and I, and please use the Q&A function, which is at the top of the screen, and Sarah and I will be monitoring the Q&A. I would now like to hand over to Heba, who will present her research.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm so delighted to be presenting this research in front of you. So in this talk, I will walk you through the insights of the Story Project, which was conducted between September 2021 and March 2022. And in the process, I will also try and give you a texture of some of the stories that we compiled through this project. So this builds on 17 in-depth stories from across Australia and from across different religious and ethnic communities. The objective of the research was to showcase Australia as a multicultural community through diverse stories of volunteering, and also to capture the multiple conceptualizations of volunteering and the range of activities that entail time freely given for the common good. My research interlocutors were people who were from emerging communities, emerging immigrant communities, as well as those who are from established communities. There were those who are overseas born and speak other languages at home, but also those who are Australian born and may not speak any other language but English, but are still socialized in culturally specific ways. And many of my interlocutors also straddled formal and informal spaces of volunteering. So I tried to use that as an advantage and get a sense of the variations between the two. This is because informal volunteering is often described as the absence of formality, but what formality actually constitutes is something that still needs to be fleshed out, and this is something that we're trying to flesh out through this project. I took an interpretive approach in my research, which meant foregrounding bottom-up conceptualizations. So wherever possible, I tried to work with the language of my research interlocutors. I also narrowed down on specific sites for analysis. These included faith-based settings, cultural clubs and associations, and also broader identity-based sites. and interest-based sites such as community gardens. But in this presentation, I will primarily draw upon insights from cultural and faith-based sites. So there are some questions that I will be asking in this research, and these are also questions that I would like you to ask with me as you listen and as you engage. These are as follows. How do we understand the nature of volunteering within multicultural contexts? And also to invert the lens, how can we understand Australian multiculturalism through diverse experiences of volunteering? And how might we better recognize and support the domain of informal volunteering? So there were some insights that emerged very early on from my research, and I will distill those insights through anecdotes. The first one was the importance of moving beyond a deficit-based approach to volunteering in multicultural contexts. So I found that voluntary activities were actually in a lot of abundance, but they were culturally nuanced, differentially articulated, and differentially conceived. The second insight was that volunteering was an important means through which community was constituted and a sense of belonging was forged. The third one was that informal volunteering in these contexts required forms of recognition that were different that is often accorded to formal volunteers or formal volunteering. And that informal volunteering often operates from a different ontological paradigm. And this has implications on how we support and recognize this domain. So I will tease out these insights by transitioning to short anecdotes and also in the process bring in some cumulative insights from my interviews. My research captured cultural nuances of volunteering. So many of my interlocutors did not even describe themselves as volunteers. In fact, when I approached them, they would direct me to formal organizations that have formal voluntary programs. And often I had to insist that no, their activities were relevant for me. And that this is what I precisely wanted to capture. So for instance, let us turn to Manjula. She moved to Australia 20 years ago from South India. And she started a community-produced garden with an open gate policy in Canberra, where women from the neighborhood could gather, they could share a cup of tea, and share resources on mental health and parenting. She described her activities as an act of love. She took inspiration from her church gatherings, where she would cook meals for her community, and described her community garden as an extension of the same ethic. Then we have Srini, a volunteer teacher at a Telugu language school in Canberra. And he described his voluntary activities in his language as Swami Chand Seva, which translated as pure service. Now, we often describe volunteering as an activity that has no expectation of financial remuneration and that is for the common good. But what's noteworthy here is the idea of working without any personal benefit, any expectation of benefit whatsoever. So not just material and financial benefit, but no personal benefit. Volunteering was purely service. My conversation with Samuel was an opportunity to learn about meaning-making practices within faith-based sites. Faber was a recent migrant from Nigeria who worked in an all-Black Pentecostal church. He described his church fellowship, or a community of 15 members, most of whom were Nigerians who had settled in Australia, some more established and others. So for incoming migrants like him, with no accommodation and with little connection to the place, the fellowship was the first point of contact. It also helped him find interim accommodation. Now, within the fellowship, there was a core workforce with specific roles and weekly commitments. Though it was unpaid and informal without bureaucratic paperwork, he did not use the word volunteer for his activities. Because, as he said, you don't volunteer for God, you work for God. However, they could use that term volunteer sometimes when they reached out to the larger community that helped out in an ad hoc basis. And something similar I could also see in my story from an Islamic perspective that pertained to a Muslim imam at a mosque, who described his activities as sadaqah, a form of charity or a form of bearing witness to the truth. And it was something that did not entail ostentation or outward recognition. Now, Imam Mustafa was paid by his community for a small remit of his services, such as leading the prayer or the sermons. But in his position as a community leader, he was often available for consultations, for advice, for helping out newly arrived communities settle down, for fundraising on their behalf through the mosque. But all of these activities were not to be enumerated from his perspective, and they were done purely for the sake of principles. So it emerged that informal activities within faith-based and cultural sites were primarily value-driven, and they were seen as an extension of one's faith or a form of cultural obligation. They also entailed a sense of serving a larger spiritual or cultural community. At times, it could be an extension of parenting or familial activities. So, for a lot of these reasons, because they were conceived from a different ontological paradigm, these activities could be invisibilized and not featured in surveys. And as I said, these activities also operated outside of a market based logic and a transactional approach. They could be relational in nature, including acts of emotional support and care, or they could be highly skilled activities in nature. For instance, they could include very professionalized skills of teaching, auditing, administrative skills, but in sites that operated relationally more than bureaucratically, and in spaces that slipped between the cracks of formality or informality. In other words, these activities were not situated outside of the organization as is generally conceived when we think about informal activities. They were situated within the organization, but most of these organizations had an informal modus operandi. Now I move to the significance of these activities. The Story Project very quickly also revealed that volunteering, informal volunteering, was a primary means through which community was constituted. I mentioned the story of Samuel, who found a spiritual community with the Black Pentecostal Church. This was crucial for him in his early settlement phases. For another recent migrant from Colombia, the concern was not to find friends, as she had plenty from her university in Melbourne, but it was a sense of being able to connect with being Australian. And she found this connection through cultivation of land and gardening as a volunteer in a church garden. In her country, this was something only farmers did, or occasionally a grandma. But here it allowed her to experience a sense of being Australian. And for some of my other interlocutors, volunteering in cultural and faith based sites was also a means of navigating the great unknown. And by cultural sites, I mean cultural associations as loose networks of community connections. They often existed as nominally registered organizations, but without an infrastructure or an office space. And there were also organizations that straddled formal structures with informal modes of operation. So, for many of my interlocutors, they gravitated towards these sites not only to preserve their cultural identity or not only for cultural familiarity, but there was also just a basic need to gain access to basic information. For instance, who might be the best pediatrician for their son, or to homeschool or not to homeschool. What is the center link, and what are the support services that might be available to housewives who are unemployed? And newly arrived communities struggled with these questions and found their answers through these sites. Finally, I have the story of Tariq that I'd like to share with you. And Tariq was born in Australia, but primarily socialized among Arab Australians. So when he started volunteering in a makeshift prayer space, which is called a musalla, where sermons are offered in English rather than in other languages as in other mosques, he found himself connecting to a wider multicultural community. He described how he never mixed in cross cultural gatherings before. But now, meeting a South African brother at a mosque who loved bushwalking, he found himself socializing with a broader community. And it is interesting that his faith specific volunteering enabled him to connect with the larger Australian, with his Australian identity. So, from these stories, we see that volunteering contributed to a sense of belonging with Australia. It also enabled horizontal connections within and between different community groups, even when evidence of vertical ties with the government remained imprecise. It also allowed emerging and established communities to forge their own unique sense of belonging to Australia, where Australianness could be commensurate with the uniqueness of one's identity and difference, rather than a homogeneous assimilation into an Anglo-Celtic mainstream. Cultural associations and faith-based networks also played a key role in the early settlement of emerging communities. As I mentioned earlier, they were not just sites for maintaining rituals and traditions, but they were also support structures in places where market and governance failed. For instance, in the midst of a housing crisis, these networks allowed newly arrived families or individuals to seek temporary accommodation, sometimes temporary accommodation and sometimes permanent accommodation. And this was especially in the case when rental agents sought credit histories and proof of financial stability at very precarious moments of an individual's settlement phase in Australia. Now, I want to talk about the question of recognition and support for these voluntary activities. So, from a policy and a scholarly perspective, we often talk about the stakes of not recognizing informal volunteering on the same level as formal volunteering. And there's a lot of research out there that indicates that informal volunteering is more prevalent among minority communities, migrant communities, and also financially vulnerable and marginalized communities. This is the case not just in Australia, but also in the US and in the UK. This is because these activities are often very easier to enter into without bureaucratic red tape and are often conducted as a labor of love. So the stakes of not recognizing the informal domain are high. It potentially means invisibilizing the relational labor and the social contributions of various social groups and communities. But the question still remains, what does recognition mean? On whose terms do we recognize? And can we get recognition wrong? In the case of formal volunteering, the operationalization of recognition that is usually done through state governments and peak bodies is through volunteer awards. Or sometimes, more discursively, there is an emphasis on incentivizing volunteering, promoting it as a pathway to employability, and emphasizing its marketability, for instance. In the case of my research, hardly any of my interlocutors in faith-based and cultural sites expressed an interest in individual recognition for their voluntary work. In fact, their responses ranged from dismissal to outright opposition. As you can see from the quote of my interlocutor on the screen, she said that if ever a day comes when I feel that I'm doing this to get into the media or the front page, then I know that I'm there for the wrong reasons. Others described recognition or individual recognition for their voluntary work as a form of ostentation. But this did not mean discarding the question of recognition. It merely opened the question of how to recognize this domain. So from my research, I distilled two kinds of recognition, ideational and material recognition. Often the kind of recognition that volunteers sought in faith-based and cultural associations was for their collective identity and for their cause. They sought acknowledgement of their socio-political concerns, an affirmation of the spirit with which they engaged and why they engaged. They also wanted to be known by the wider community on their terms and have a voice that represents who they are. The other kind of recognition that they sought was material. In terms of material recognition, the issue of physical space and infrastructural capacities came up time and time again in my interviews. So when volunteers in faith-based and in cultural sites wanted to showcase their identity or their rituals to the wider community, there were not enough open spaces or accessible, affordable venues. Parks were unsuitable for their events. And as you can see from one of the quotes on the screen, and someone put it, nothing is free, only we human beings are free. But just when the picture started to look bleak in terms of platforms of recognition, other stories started to emerge through this project. These were stories of relational and material support between faith-based and cultural communities. where one church would lend its physical space free of rent to a Muslim community, for instance, during Ramadan for iftar gatherings. Or in one case, an Afghan individual from a humanitarian background decided to form a Pashtun association in South Australia. And he wanted to do this to help newly arrived families settle down and preserve their culture. However, he did not have resources of his own, so he found support from his colleagues from the Red Cross and Relationships Australia. These were colleagues with whom he had volunteered with formerly. They stepped up to help him register his organization and establish a website. So he drew upon that kind of relational support from formal volunteering organizations in a way that was not necessarily built into the formal voluntary programs. So this makes us think more about intersectionalities between formal and informal spaces of volunteering based on material and relational support, and how we might think of these intersectionalities without one co-opting the other. In other words, we still want to preserve informal volunteering and the informal voluntary domain on its own terms. So I'm going to end with this visualization of a volunteering gradient as food for thought. Again, this is something that emerged from the field and through my interviews, and it depicts how informal volunteering leads to formal volunteering. It often led to formal volunteering, and it often led to institution building because of institutional needs of funding and longevity. But often it also emerged out of formal volunteering. So there were instances when there were people who were volunteering with refugee families, for instance, as formal volunteers, and they ended up making very strong friendships, and that spilled into informal volunteering that persevered beyond their voluntary programs. But actually, the intersectionalities and webs of relations may be even more complex than what this diagram suggests. Because this diagram is telling you about formal and informal intersectionalities, whereas there can be relational webs even between informal networks. So I want to leave you with the question of how we might think of better ideational and material support through this interface. And I also want you to perhaps come in from your context and show we have a rich audience from different backgrounds and associations. So it would be wonderful if you could come in with your thoughts and your questions and your comments, and I will leave you with this food for thought and hand it over to Sarah for some reflections.
Thank you so much, Heba. And I know that people probably have lots of wonderful questions, so I won't speak for too long. But just wanted to reflect that this project happened in tandem with the development of the National Strategy for Volunteering. And the reason it was such a critical piece of the evidence base was because it gave us that qualitative lens and brought to the fore the voices of people that Heba spoke to that weren't necessarily captured through some of the other research that we did. So our Volunteering in Australia research project really gave us a quantitative base to look at volunteering. And it did show some of the things that Heba talked about in terms of the underlying themes. But the story project really helped us understand the nuanced and culturally specific, I suppose, lenses and experiences that we otherwise may not have captured through the project. And so in the final iteration of the national strategy and underpinning our 11 strategic objectives, we were able to make sure that the stories were reflected in a way that the national strategy was able to demonstrate we were capturing all of these different types of volunteering. And then going forward, what it means is that we have a base, I suppose, to be able to consider how volunteering needs to be conceptualized in a way that actually supports and recognizes these diverse forms of community participation that may not always come up in the conversations that we traditionally have in a really formal way. So it really was a critical part of the evidence base. And we're really grateful to everyone who participated through that, and also those who were able to help us translate translate those findings into the national strategy itself. So we're really interested to hear people's questions about all of this, how it relates to the national strategy, and I'll hand back to Sue to facilitate the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Heba. I should have said at the beginning that the slides and the recording will be available. We'll circulate them after. So I'm sure lots of you were scribbling notes, but they will also be available afterwards, and as will be the full report, which is now available on the Volunteering Australia website. So there's a great resource for you there. Please do, there's an opportunity now for Q&A, so please do start putting questions in the Q&A. While you're doing that, Heba, I might ask the first question, if that's okay. And I'd just like you to reflect more really on your last slide about the spectrum that you were showing, and and just perhaps say a little bit more about how the informal kind of moves into the formal and vice versa. I just think that was a really kind of interesting aspect of the research.
Yeah, so I mean, I wasn't able to flesh out all the stories in this presentation, but there was this very interesting story of, people who ended up building an institution out of informal volunteering, and that was a childcare service that was specific to Chinese families. And I think there was a strong need that certain community members felt in Sydney, where they wanted their children to be socialized in a setting which was culturally familiar. So we had individuals who came and who started volunteering and started looking into what would go into building that institution, and they were sort of classifying that struggle to build an institution as also as a form of informal volunteering. But even when the institution was being built, in the process of that institution building, there were families that were coming in. They finally managed to get a site, to secure a site. They did not have enough money for it. There was a lot of bureaucratic red tape going back and forth. And when they finally managed to secure a site, they did not have enough funds to fix it. So there were families that were coming in and painting. And all of this was a form of, it was also a form of community-led problem solving, because this community identified a gap in the service and they wanted to step in and, do something about it. So that was one very interesting story, where you had all of these initiatives and self-help initiatives actually build an institution. There was also another interesting story of an organization that started off as just as an announcement on Facebook during COVID by someone who really wanted to help feed families, during the lockdown. And he just decided to put up an announcement on Facebook, and he started getting requests. And he was astounded by the kind of requests and the amount of requests that he was getting. And his own motivations for doing so was just to follow in the footsteps of his father, because this is what his father would do in his village in India. His father believed that if you have like 100 rupees, you donate 80 and keep 20 to yourself. But these initiatives are met with some challenges at some point. They're easier to get into because they don't require the kind of red tape and bureaucratic procedures. But ultimately, when you're soliciting donations and you want to ensure the longevity of these initiatives, they need to be registered and they need to sort of transition into more formal organizations. Often these organizations did transition, but they also retained a lot of informal characteristics. So they were in that gray zone between formality and informality. So those were very important insights, because they made you realize that you can't think of informal volunteering as something that is completely unmediated by institutions. As you can see that even in cultural sites and in faith-based sites, they're happening within organizations. And in some instances, they lead to institution building. Now, there were other occasions where they spilled out of formal volunteering initiatives. And as I mentioned, that there were people who would be volunteering with refugee communities, for instance. And in those instances, formal voluntary programs helped because they were more trustworthy. They would do all the background checks. So it was easier to sort of work in those spaces. But once you started working in those spaces as a formal volunteer, you developed those friendships. And then you're going above and beyond. And then you have this conception of volunteering that is not time bound. There's no concept of helping within a schedule. You know, a lot of some of my interlocutors say that uh, is care time bound? Like, do you have a sense of, you know, can you actually put it in those terms? Uh, so those so those were instances of volunteering that was spilling out of formal initiatives. And I still think that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. This project sort of gave us a breadth uh, of different perspectives across different spectrums. And we could narrow in on each of these stories and work out what might be the challenges of informal initiatives and as they transition, and why do they need to transition to more formalized institutions. And also how we might preserve this domain on its own terms, as I mentioned.
Thank you, Heather. Would you want to move the slide back one just so people know we're still on Q&A?
Oh, okay.
And do pop your questions in the Q&A function as they occur to you. I think
I thought it might be interesting to pick up on the comment there from the person from Volunteer Southwest around love the idea of relational webs. We don't take these seriously enough within volunteering, because building on Heather's story, I actually went and visited the volunteering program that was born out of the childcare centre in Sydney, and it is a huge program now in Sydney. And I went to their New Year celebration and got to speak firsthand to the volunteers that had set it up. And one of the things that they expressed about the way that volunteering happens in their community is that quite often people come along and participate in activities. And then slowly over time, there's this natural progression into leadership type roles, into other projects and activities. And then people become volunteers. And they only formalise that relationship insofar as, from a compliance perspective, they might be required really fluid activity. So they don't necessarily recruit volunteers in the way that other organisations might, but so much of it comes from within the community itself. And then a second example I'm reminded of was when I was out in Bendigo last year and I went to visit the food share, and they had a lot of challenges during COVID in that regional area. And it was actually through relational webs that they were able to make sure that they were getting food relief out to different multicultural communities. And a lot of that activity was happening on WhatsApp, which isn't necessarily something other organisations have as part of their communication processes. But it meant that by having one person in that community connected with the Bendigo Food Share, they were able to make sure that they reached out much broader than they otherwise would have been able to do. And I think that those innovations in terms of the informality that those connections and networks bring is a really important thing for us to think about as we move forward, especially with implementing the strategy. But I think to your point, Heather, in terms of how we actually think about what structures we can put around informal volunteering, not to hinder or to formalise necessarily, but just to make sure that people have the resources and support that they need to be able to continue doing the work they are in community.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I just want to pick up on that point that, you know, I talked about sort of how informal initiatives sometimes seek relational support or material support, and they might get that from formal organizations, but it also works the other way around. And again, that these are things that you can look into in much more depth as separate research projects in and of themselves. But there are organizations, for instance, that are working with more vulnerable communities, or they're working with newly arrived communities from at-risk backgrounds. They might come from humanitarian backgrounds, and they have formal volunteers. But even in those contexts, you need interpreters. You need people who will understand the sensitivities of maybe the region that a refugee family might be coming from, and be able to communicate with them. And in those contexts, they need to tap into community leaders that are, again, based in these cultural associations or faith-based sites. And if we think of the aged care sector, for instance, you know, there's this emphasis on diversity and inclusion, and how do we get volunteers to cater to the kind of diversity that may exist within the aged care. So if you have people from different multicultural backgrounds, how do we ensure that they're volunteers, formal volunteers, who are catering to their specific social needs? And in those contexts, these sites, as I highlighted, cultural associations, faith-based sites, are very important sort of reservoirs for recruitment. I don't know if recruitment is the right word, but I feel like if there are more connections between these semi-formal organizations or informal initiatives and formal initiatives, that also strengthens the formal ecosystem. So that was something that emerged. I also want to say a little bit more about the space aspect of it. It's such a simple insight, but it is so important. And if we think about the spaces that we have, even in terms of physical space that is not being used, and that can be put to use, for me, that's something that is quite small, but it's potentially revolutionary of how we're making, um, how we're more effectively using the resources that we have, including physical infrastructure, and how can we make that available to communities in their time of need.
Thanks, Heba. We've got lots of questions coming through now, so I'm going to just turn to them. The first one's from Tina. Hello, Tina. Are there any other countries that have found the solution to supporting informal volunteering without stifling the creativity and flexibility it provides? Now, I know this wasn't a piece of international comparison, but I was wondering if you have any reflections on that. I know at the National Volunteering Conference, you were part of the Informal Volunteering Symposium, and there was a couple of colleagues from the UK presented there. My sense is we don't have the answers, but there's quite a lot of different countries looking for them. But your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it is a separate piece of research that needs to be done, but I think that the dilemma is pretty consistent across different contexts, of how to not stifle the creativity of this space. And yeah, I can only answer by saying that this is opportunity for us and also those in the audience to put our heads together and think of further avenues of research that can be done to tease out those specific case studies.
Yeah.
And I would invite anyone from the audience who might also have a response to this to jump in, because I'm sure that there are a lot of people who have a wealth of knowledge that they're also bringing in.
I will.
Someone says that volunteering in grassroots spaces can prevent stifling the creativity.
Yeah. Do comment on that. And we'll come back to it. I'll go to another question from Caitlin. Hello, Caitlin. Were there any insights regarding time-limited informal initiatives? So were participants comfortable with activities not transitioning into more formal or perhaps ongoing initiatives?
Were there participants not transitioning? Okay, I'm going to think about that, but the question of time for me is important. I think, yeah, I think with the question of time, I can answer this in a slightly different way by juxtaposing formal volunteering experiences and informal volunteering experiences. So there were a lot of families who had recently arrived and they felt the need to volunteer for employability. And they felt like they were putting in time to do so. And that time was coming at the expense of sometimes very real financial needs and concerns. I had one interlocutor who shared his story of how his wife was unwell. And when he came, he had to sort of, because this was a requirement where you need local experience for jobs. So there was time that he was putting into his formal volunteering, which he loved at the end of the day, but there were some constraints that were coming with it. There were financial constraints that were coming with it. And it was coming at the expense of work that he could have done, other kinds of work that he could have done for his family. But in contrast, informal volunteering was seen as this unbound zone where time did not matter, because it was, again, it was not seen as something that needs to be done. It was not seen as something that's being done out of a compulsion. Because you need to get a job, I need to do this. It was done because it was a labor of love. So the same individual who could be talking about those sorts of time investments in one context could describe time investments in a different context in a very different register. So if he's started a Pashtun association, he's organizing multicultural cricket tournaments because this is something that young people want, and it's also an opportunity for young Pashtuns and Afghans to connect with a broader Australian community. It was that time investment sort of was unbounded. So I guess that's the insight that I got in terms of time. And I think it wasn't so much that they were wary of the time they were putting in their informal activities, but I think that those questions could arise when it came to formal voluntary activities.
Thanks,
I hope
Heba.
I've answered your question.
Yes. Thank you. Sarah, was there a question that jumped out to you looking at the Q&A?
Just picking up on the sort of second half of Caitlin's question, I think a lot of the anecdotal evidence we got through the national strategy process is that some people are really interested in informal volunteering, especially in sectors like sport, where people are doing it because they have a familial connection, so might be coaching their son's basketball team or something like that, and they actually aren't looking at doing more ongoing formal volunteering, but sometimes the pressures of feeling like there isn't anyone else available to volunteer means that people end up doing more and more and more. I think as well, picking up on Heba's example about the cricket team, is that one of the things that emerged through the National Strategy Project was that a lot of the volunteering that is conceptualised for people, especially migrants and refugees, tends to be things that the structures of our society decide they should be doing, rather than being things that they want to do necessarily. So we need to consider that when we are working with multicultural, interfaith and other diverse communities and historically disadvantaged communities, that we are engaging with them in volunteering on their terms, rather than asking them to participate in more Western forms of volunteering that might not resonate with the reasons that they get involved in volunteering in the first place. And also just being really cognizant, I think, of that potential exploitation. So we did hear some stories last year about people who, like Heba mentioned, had to volunteer as a pathway to employment, but 6 months in weren't getting any closer to getting employment, but still felt obligated and pressured to do quite significant amounts of informal volunteering, particularly in the care and support sector, to try and be able to get that work experience to get a role. So if we are positioning volunteering as a pathway to employment, we need to make sure there is a pathway, without just expecting people to continuously, give of their time without having those outcomes being plausible for them.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to go to another question. So this is Lyra. Hello, Lyra. So she asked, they asked, for migrants, did translating and interpreting come up in your interviews as an identified way of informal volunteering?
Yes, actually, with one of the stories of the Pashtun individual, he actually engaged in a lot of translation services, and that was actually not informal. He was doing as part of formal volunteering in some occasions, and but at the same time, I think there were aspects of it, like he was also helping out newly arrived families to settle down. So I think that does entail that kind of translation interpretation. But there were some formal translation exercises that he had done as well, which made me think of the question of, like what falls into volunteering and what should fall into volunteering and what shouldn't fall. But I think that is a question beyond the informal space. I have some thoughts on the employability, but I'll hold on to that.
Okay. I was going to pick up on a comment from Delivia, and also something that I was going to ask as well about this point about recognition, because I thought it was a really kind of interesting finding from your research. Delivia's mentioned that she's from CAS, and that they're often being asked by informal volunteers groups for support, especially for venue, insurance support, as said, material recognition. And yeah, I just thought, perhaps you could say a little bit more about, what you found from the research on recognition and, how it seemed to differ from what we think of recognition in more formal settings.
Yeah.
And this idea about ideational, but also
Right.
material recognition.
Yeah. So I think in my presentation, I talked about ideational recognition as sort of a collective recognition of the principles and the ethics of why they engage and what they do, and also a recognition of their identity. So collective recognition of those concerns. So if there was a Sikh volunteer who's running a food van, they want recognition of their identity. Like this is something that is an intrinsic part of their faith. And they would not necessarily want to be acknowledged in individual terms. It would be considered an anathema in many ways. But if there was an engagement with their broader cultural identity and their principles, then this was something that they sought. Um, so that was collective recognition, and collective recognition could also be of the issues that concern them. So discrimination, if they're facing a lot of discrimination and they're mobilizing and they've set up a Muslim Voice radio, it's because it's coming from those concerns. And again, one could in individualistic terms, celebrate that achievement, but what would that achievement mean if you haven't connected with why that initiative came up in the first place? So I think that was the broader point about ideational recognition. But I also want to make another point, which I did not make in my presentation, and which ties in with what I wanted to speak earlier about employability as well. As I mentioned that informal volunteering was conceived on a different paradigm, like the idea of it was different, it's done as service. But at the same time, people recognized the coincidental benefits of it in terms of employability and what Sarah was asking before. And I think it's very, very important for us to acknowledge that these activities were not just emotional support, care, but they involved highly specialized skills. And for young folks, for young folks who've just moved in, those were employable like skills. Those are skills that have transferable value. So I found that a lot of some of my interlocutors were hesitant to platform those experiences, not only because they were viewed from a different ontological paradigm, but they were also concerned of how they might come across to potential employers. So if they're talking about faith-based volunteering, how would it come across to potential employers? And I think so that's a different angle on the question of recognition. So we want to recognize their activities on their terms and on the principles that they are engaging with. But there is this question of the richness of the work that they're doing. And there are often cases where individuals are very heavily involved in these informal initiatives, and these initiatives can help them get a job. They can potentially, those experiences can help them get a job. So how can they speak of those experiences, and in turn, how can employers make space and create space for recognition of those activities? So often I had one, in the case of one interlocutor, Manjula, who founded a community-produced garden. When she moved to Australia, she was highly qualified in India, with several psychology degrees and qualifications. But when she moved, she wasn't able to transition into that career because of accreditation and all those issues that you encounter. But when she started doing this informal sort of community produce garden, and she started getting involved in all of this, after many years, when she did apply for a job, this question came up almost incidentally. You know, what other interests do you have, or what other hobbies do you have? And she had an opportunity to speak at length, and the employers were very impressed. So it actually worked in her favor. So I guess my point is that we need to think through this question of employability in a nuanced fashion, without sort of limiting informal initiatives to that question.
Yeah. Thank you, Heba. Very interesting. We could keep talking about that. I'm going to go to another question, though. This is from Jessica. Did you find that people from refugee and asylum seeking backgrounds were reluctant to share feedback because of their fear induced by structures about assimilating into Australian culture?
Yeah, so I think in this case, my positionality sort of helped in the research, and we often talk about this when we do interpretive research. Though, so when I was speaking to the Afghan individual from a Pashtun background, I mean, we have enough cultural similarity, sometimes even, I mean, not entirely linguistic, but even in terms of, you know, terms that we use, and on occasion, so I think having that kind of, me having that sort of multicultural positionality and interviewing people from similar multicultural upbringing was an asset in the research, because it helped develop that kind of rapport. And that is something that I emphasize in my research as an interpretive study, that we also pay attention to metadata, people's emotional responses. I felt that when I was when I reached out to the Muslim imam, there was a sense of reluctance initially, even though I am from the same faith-based background. But then I was able to contextualize that reluctance as a reluctance to talk about his individual accomplishments. But when I asked him to talk about, again, the broader principles of why he's doing what he is doing, there was a lot of enthusiasm. So, in fact, there was a lot of willingness to speak about where they were coming from rather than a reluctance to share that. I think it felt like this was something that needed to be heard.
Thank you, Heba. Sarah, do we have any other questions?
One last question from the Q&A, which is a bit of a doozy to finish on, that I don't know that I have a good answer to, Marie, but we'll see if anyone else does when I ask it. So Marie has said there's been lots of conversations on the word volunteer and how it doesn't always resonate to groups like multicultural groups and young people. What is the magic word to connect with people who don't identify themselves in that way?
You don't have to have an answer, Heba, but thought reflections. Maybe
and anyone, please, in the chat as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a question. That's a great question, and I don't have an answer to that, but I can tell you how I approached it in my research. That yeah, I just showed an interest in what they were doing. So I identified activities that fulfilled the definition of time freely given for the common good. And I did some research into what was happening in different spaces. And I showed an interest in those activities and let them define it on their terms. So they could say that it was voluntary, but they were not necessarily calling themselves volunteers. But those activities could be voluntary. And I don't know if that's the solution to it, that we refer to the nature of the activities as voluntary, whereas we recognize that they might call themselves as volunteers, or they might call themselves as God's workforce, you know?
Thanks, Heba. We're rapidly running out of time. Thank you to everyone who has put comments in the chat as well. I noticed Mel had referred to some research that looks really interesting, so please do send that through to us. Before we do the wrap up, I wanted to just ask Heba and Sarah for any final reflections. Heba, over to you first.
I guess my final reflections are just that, you know, this is a beginning of our research into a field that is of growing relevance and interest. And through these 17 stories, we captured a breadth, and there are certainly opportunities to narrow down and conduct more research. And I can identify several topics that would be very, very useful. For instance, just focusing in on communities at risk or more vulnerable communities, and get a perspective of people who are perhaps not as financially stable, because I think a lot of my interlocutors were coming from a place of privilege as well, having settled down and then recounting their experience. So, what does it look like when you're in that sort of vulnerable phase? I think that's a topic that can be teased out. Informal volunteering in times of crises is also very important. Um, and I would say, yeah, just more on these intersectionalities. Like, I mean, we can celebrate informal volunteering as something that contributes to community, but what are the challenges? What are the nitty-gritty challenges, as somebody also raised in an international context or in our context? And I think that requires us to move from breadth to depth, and maybe that we can think about that as our future sort of goal.
Thank you, Heather. Sarah, some final reflections.
I think not much to follow up on after that. A very succinct and eloquent final remark from Heba, just to say that the national strategy, that the purpose of some of the strategic objectives is to answer some of the questions that we've asked today. What are the words that enable people to recognise and identify with wanting to do what I might call volunteering, but someone else doesn't? And that this is the start of, I think, very exciting changes in the volunteering ecosystem in terms of how we better recognise, support and celebrate diverse manifestations of volunteering in a whole range of different contexts, including multiculturalism. So stay in touch with us as we continue to do a lot of really wonderful work in this space. And as always, tell us if you are doing great work in this space so that we can shine a spotlight on that as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And just to echo what Heather said, we do, want to do more work in this area, more research in this area. Heather has been doing some work with Carolyn Hendricks and Elise Klein at the ANU, and we'll hopefully be able to bring that to you all in a few months' time. But yes, keen that we look at some further issues in depth as well. So really, my job is just to wrap up. Congratulations again to Heather on this research. I think we would all agree that it's very insightful and very important work. Thank you to everyone for attending and participating today. As I mentioned, a link to the recording and the slides from today will be circulated to you all, but you can now access the actual report on the Volunteering Australia website. The national strategy, which Sarah referred to, and all of its research is available on the national strategy website. Also, remember, it's as if you could forget, it's National Volunteer Week next week. So please do go to the VA website, and there's, as many of you know, there's lots of great resources on there that you can use. And thanks again to the Scanlon Foundation for making this research possible. And thank you all for coming along. See you soon.